This is the fourth meeting of the Bills Committee. Can we invite the administration into the conference room, please? Professor Lau, Chairman of the Medical Council, and Dr. Chung Tak Hong, Chairman of the Preliminary Investigation Committee, are both attending. We've scheduled 4 hours for this meeting. At around 4:30 p.m., I will take a break for about 10 minutes, and our meeting will go up to 6:25, and it will end there, okay? Now, after the last meeting, 3 submissions have been received, and these have been forwarded to members before the meeting, and they've also been passed on to the administration. The Secretary has also issued 2 documents for members' reference. That is the paper number CB-22098, 16 to 17-03, which is the drafting the views of the legal advice of the Bills Committee, dated the 7th of September to the Bills Committee and the administration, rather. And another paper is from a letter from Mr. Eddie Ju to me. That's paper number CB-22105/16-70-01. And just before the meeting, Mr. Pierre Chan sent us a paper which is about the inquiry conference room arrangement of the Medical Council. So perhaps the administration could provide the information requested either in writing or at the next meeting. On the 20th of July, members had discussion, and there's a list of items to be followed up on. That's paper CB bracket. That's a CB 22098/16-70-02, and that's the reply by the administration. May I now invite Mr. Chris Sun, Head of Healthcare Planning and Development Office of the Food and Health Bureau, to take us through the administration's reply. And then on the in legislative proposals for the complaint investigation and inquiry mechanism of the improving and the revenue improvement, there's a PowerPoint later, I understand. Thank you. Yes, we had 3 meetings and 4 sessions. In July, we heard views of members and also members of the public, including representatives of doctors and patients and so on. We've also talked about limited registration. The Hong Kong Medical Association, the Hospital Authority, and professors from 2 universities came to explain to members about limited registration. And all the details are in the paper, as the chairman pointed out. Taking this opportunity, I would like to summarize the various issues relating to limited registration, and then I'll invite Mr. Fong to take us through the new arrangement for handling complaints and inquiries under the bill. Now, the purpose of the Medical Registration Amendment Bill 2017 has only one purpose, which is about limited registration. Right now, the Hong Kong Medical Council could only give approval for 1 year. It's to be extended to 3 years. And that's about first application and subsequent renewal. And apart from that change, the criteria of vetting and so on are exactly the same, so the requirements remain as stringent. For doctors with limited registration, they are same as other fully registered doctors. Every year they must submit a practicing certificate for the Hong Kong Medical Council. And then on their professional standards, whether they are fully registered doctors or doctors with limited registration, they are under the supervision of the Medical Council. And then previous meetings, the Medical Council and the 2 doctors and the 2 universities engaged doctors with limited registration, and at previous meetings we talked about that much. Now, for doctors with limited registration, there is strong requirement for the housing authority to hire them in helping with relieving the staff shortage. First, the applicants must have the same specialist qualifications similar to that required by the Hong Kong Academy of Medicine. That's the first one. Secondly, the doctors must have 3 years or more of experience working in hospital. And then applicants must speak fluent English and Cantonese, apart from the anesthetists, those working in pathology and so on. Now, on the mainland, there is not a qualification framework for specialists. So the hospital authority is not going to hire anyone without qualifications equivalent to that specified by the Hong Kong Academy of Medicine. In other words, the hospital authority is not going to hire any doctors without the required qualifications. Now, on how many made applications to the medical to the hospital authority, and how many of these applications refer to the medical council for vetting, from 2011 to 12 to 2016 to 17, the hospital authority received 276 applications, and some did not meet one of the requirements, and for 67 cases, the applications were undertaken for other reasons, either because there's incomplete information or the applicants withdrew the applications. And only 33 cases of limited registration were eventually submitted. So in hiring doctors with limited registration, we can see from this data that the hospital authority adopts stringent criteria. Now, if we extend the registration period from 1 year to 3 years, how many more doctors will then come to Hong Kong? Of course, we don't have the data, but we believe for a registration of 3 years, it will be more appealing, and then we'll be able to bring in more qualified and doctors of high standard coming to serve at the hospital authority. For the two universities, in terms of limited registration, hiring policy, there are again stringent policies. Now, the two doctors, whether the two universities, whether they could hire such doctors, we have again sought views of the Department of Justice. Now, for doctors with limited registration, they must not take part in any duties outside of that specified. And Hong Kong U and Chinese U have never approved doctors with limited registration to take up other work, and they've also not received such applications. So for doctors with limited registration, even if they have the consent of the two universities, they may not take part in any work as outside that specified by the universities. And there are clear guidelines. If doctors with limited registration are appointed to take up consultation service, it cannot be more than 10% of their total duty hours. There are specific guidelines on the part of the two universities. There is also a monitoring mechanism, is to make sure that doctors with limited registration, when they take part in consultation service, including providing clinical service, they will comply with stringent requirements. So for doctors with limited registration, they're hired to come and work for different reasons by the hospital authority and the two universities. For example, hospital authority doctors, they are here to do clinical work. And for doctors hired by the two universities, they're mostly engaged in teaching duties. So therefore, the requirements for the hire of doctors with limited registration differ, and we can understand why that's the case. So after summing up the scenarios involving doctors with limited registration, let me also address other points as previously raised by deputations. Now, first, under the bill, one of the primary purposes is to improve the complaint investigation, disciplinary inquiry mechanism of the Medical Council of Hong Kong. Now, at the tripartite platform and in our discussion with stakeholders, is in general supported. At the moment, there are many restrictions under the current legislation. There must be a preliminary investigation committee, and there can only be one medical advisor. And at every inquiry, the legal advisor must be present. So that means that at any one time, only one hearing could be held. Now, there are 4 preliminary committees, investigation committees, or PIC or the preliminary committee, there must be the legal advisor present, so therefore the capacities of hearing are limited, and also the other legal advice officers cannot take the place of secretaries to attend hearings. And even though if we have provided additional resources, that is only a small relief to the huge backlog. That's why there's need to amend the legislation. So for complaints handled by the medical council, the efficiency could be enhanced, and also there could be more flexibility. It's hoped that within a reasonable time frame we could handle complaints. For the 2017 bill compared to the 2016 bill, it's more comprehensive in addressing the bottlenecks currently found in the legislation. And also, under the Medical Council, we propose to put in place a modernized mechanism in dealing with complaints. First of all, for PIC, it will no longer be carried out by Medical Council, but rather there will be separate panels to carry out the in preliminary investigation. And then for the PIC and the number of preliminary investigation panels, the numbers will be, the inquiry panels, they'll be set by the Medical Council. And also the Medical Council will appoint the chairman and vice chairman of the inquiry panels. And then for the PIC, there must be 7 members, 4 are doctors, 3 are lay members. As for inquiry panels, there must be 5 members, 3 doctors and 2 lay members. And then under the bill, we're going to enhance the lay participation, and there will be empowerment for setting up more inquiry panels and PICs. And also, Medical Council members and assessors will have equal powers and rights to take part in the work of these inquiry panels. And also there will be sufficient doctors and lay members to take part in the work of the inquiry panels. For assessors, the number will be increased from 14 to 140 at most. For doctors, that will be increased from 10 to 80. For lay members, from the current 4 to be increased to 60 at most. And to cope with the expected increase in caseload, there will be more legal advisors. Under the new bill, the Medical Council may appoint more than 1 legal advisor, and also private councils in private practice may also be the secretary, represent the secretary at inquiries.
住呢個嘅係投訴處理咧，因為
On the complaint handling, I'd like to brief you on the details via this PowerPoint presentation. First of all, in terms of handling complaints by the Medical Council, in recent years we received 500 cases on average every year, and currently we have a backlog of 760 cases, and at the PIC stage we have about 300 cases in PIC stage and another 300 in the PIC stage. On average, each case requires at least 6 years from receipt of case to inquiry, and the waiting time for new cases is about 1 year. The objective of this bill is to clear the backlog within 3 years and complete the majority of cases requiring inquiry within 2 years. So those are our objectives. In terms of the key proposals, I'd like to first talk about our current procedures and the proposed procedures. Currently, there are 3 parts to procedure. First of all, preliminary consideration at the pre-PIC stage, where the PIC chairman, vice chairman, and 1 lay member, they will rule whether the case involved is frivolous and require no follow-up. If at least 1 member feels that further follow-up is warranted, the case will be taken to the PIC. The PIC will then decide whether the case would be passed on to the Medical Council for follow-up. And at the our arrangement for the pre-PIC stage remains unchanged, but some lay assessors would be introduced to help out. And there can also be more than 1 PIC Currently, only one is allowed. In the future, there can be 3, 4, and 5, manpower permitting. As for the inquiry panel, we can only have one at the same time, but in the future, we can have multiple inquiry panels because we can have multiple legal advisors. With more participation, there would be enough members taking part in the work. And with that, we also need to expand the pool of assessors. Currently, there are 14, including 10 doctors, 4 lay members. Among the 10 doctors, they are nominated by 5 institutions, including 2 each from the HA, Department of Health, Hong Kong UCHK, and Hong Kong Academy of Medicine. The 4 other lay members are nominated by the Secretary for Food and Health. In the future, we want to expand the pool to a minimum of 28 and a maximum of 140. They will continue to be appointed by MCHK, and MCHK will also be empowered to set qualification requirements. And the composition of assessors will be set out in the schedule of the ordinance. There will be 16 to 80 doctors, 2 to 10 each nominated by 8 institutions. Apart from the 5 existing institutions, we will add Hong Kong Medical Association, HKDU, and PDA. And the number of lay persons will be increased to 12 to 60, and 2 to 10 will be nominated by each of these organizations, including patient organizations, Hong Kong Bar Association, Law Society of Hong Kong, Hong Kong Council of Social Service, Hong Kong Institute of Certified Public Accountants, and the government. There will be a maximum of 140 assessors to take part in the PICs and inquiry panels. Now, details of the PIC. Currently, the PIC is composed of 7 members, among which 3 are MCHK members, in which at least 1 would be a lay member, and there would also be 4 non-MCHK members, and they are doctors whom the HAMA, DHHA, and a MCHK member can each nominate. In other words, there are 6 doctors and 1 lay council member. The chairman and deputy chairman are elected from among MCHA members. The quorum is 3 members, at least 1 of whom shall be a lay council member, subject to a majority being doctors. In the future, we will still have 7 members, but the composition would be 4 doctors and 3 lay persons. They can be MCHA members or assessors, and the same goes for lay persons. Again, the chairman and deputy chairman will be taken up by MCHA members or assessors, so there will be more flexibility. But the principle is that the majority will still be doctors while we increase lay participation. The quorum would be similar. At least 1 of them must be a lay person, subject to the majority being doctors. And for inquiries, currently the council they are currently conducted by the council. The quorum is 5 MCHA members or 3 MCHA members plus 2 assessors. At least 1 must be a lay council member, and the majority must be doctors. The chairman would be the council chairman, and if the council chairman was involved in the preceding investigation, a chairman will be elected from among its MCHA members. The inquiry has full disciplinary power to make order and review its decisions. And in our proposal, there will be more than one inquiry panel. In terms of composition, there will be 5 members, including 3 doctors and 2 lay persons. They can be MCHK members or assessors. The inquiry committee chairman would be appointed by MCHK, and the chairman will be chosen among the MCHK members and assessors. And the disciplinary power would be equivalent to the current arrangement. In the future, there will be 140 MCHA assessors, and they can take part in the inquiry panels and PICs. Hopefully, we can then speed up the progress of handling the inquiries. In terms of legal support, we will allow the appointment of more than one legal advisor. And in terms of providing legal support for disciplinary inquiries, currently the Secretary for Justice may appoint legal advisors, legal officers to carry out the statutory duties of the Secretary, and in the future, the Secretary for Justice may appoint any counsel or solicitor in private practice so that there could be more flexibility. In the long run, we hope to complete the majority of cases requiring inquiry within 2 years. That's all for my presentation. Members, I'd like to talk about our schedule of meeting next month. It will be on the 25th of October, a Wednesday at 8:30, and after that we will proceed to the Council. So I'd like to remind members of the date of the next meeting. Today, the chairman of the Medical Council and the chairman of the PIC of the Medical Council are both here. Previously, we spent a lot of time discussing the extension of the period of limited registration from 1 year to 3, and today we are focusing on the PICs, and with both of them here, they can help answer questions. 3 members are waiting to speak: Dr. Pierre Chen, Dr. Kwok Ki, and Ms. Claudia Mo. 5 minutes, please. Dr. Chen, thank you. I'd like to follow up on the government's response from last time. I'm looking at CB brackets 2 2098/1617 brackets 02 page 1, and this is the first paper, and the second paper was from a previous government response on the 27th of paper 1827/16-17 brackets 02 page 6. And I'd like to know about the number of doctors with limited registration under the HA. And I'd like to follow up on the questions, the responses given by the government. And in the response, there was a table, and the figure was 34, and under family medicine, the well, last time that was the area, that was the focus of our discussion, and I asked for clarification of the table. That's why we received this new table. When I look at the HA's table, the figure given was 34. But when I look at the response given on the 20th of July, when I look at this latest paper, the figure was 17. I see the figures for Hong Kong UNCHA tally, but for the HA, the figures given were 34 and 17, so the figures did not tally. And there was a person with medical credentials from China and Canada, but this person was no longer mentioned in the latest response. So what happened to that person? Can the government guide me on these tables, please? Chairman, Dr. Chen talked about the figure of 34. It referred to the number of doctors over the years. And in our latest response, there are 17 practicing doctors, so there is no conflict. If Dr. Chan would like to know where those 34 doctors were trained and what their specialties are, we are happy to provide the details. And our understanding is to look into details and qualifications of the 17 practicing doctors under the HA. We do have information of the 34 doctors, some of which have departed. I would like the details. But when I look at the text, according to the response last time, as of the end of June 2017, there was 34 doctors. And for this response in Part A1, and countries, regions where basic medical training was received, the figures did not tally. So I cannot quite understand the difference between the both. But thank you very much for explaining the difference. But I like the details of the 34 doctors you mentioned last time. So I just like a clear breakdown. I'd like to know where they were from. So is everything clear? We are happy to offer the details. All right. Any follow-up questions? That's all for this part. Thank you. Dr. Kiki Kwok. Thank you. For doctors with limited registration hired by the HA, the requirements are rather clear. There are 3 requirements. But for doctors with limited registration hired by the 2 universities, the requirements are different from the HA. And I received a case from the Prince of Wales Hospital, which was reported. There was a doctor with limited registration. When carrying out clinical work, a medical blunder was committed and a complaint was lodged by the patient. And I'm sure the 2 doctors who are working at the Prince of Wales Hospital are aware of that. I'd like to know that at the 2 universities, for doctors hired by the HA, they have to meet certain requirements. For a lot of doctors from overseas, we understand that they are well qualified or experienced. Some of them are academics visiting from the mainland for a short period, and these academics do not have qualifications that correspond to your qualifications under the Hong Kong AM. However, they have to carry out certain clinical work, such as prematernal checks, and there have been unfavorable incidents or scenarios. I like to know whether the requirements actually coincide with the MCHK's requirements and whether there is a loophole. You are empowering the universities and they have total autonomy on what they want to do. There is a lack of gatekeeping. And the MCHK would allow most of these cases. However, when we talk about clinical work, such as surgeries or diagnosis, their work would directly affect patients. If they just carry out teaching and research, we don't really mind. But if they are to conduct medical procedures, there would be issues if their standards are not guaranteed, and if we open the floodgates for Well, for the case I mentioned, well, I won't go into detail. The patients who were directly affected and their treatment. And I'm concerned about such loopholes, and you are going to relax the period to 3 years. And so Professor Lau or Dr. Chang, for limited registration for the two universities, is there any examination or test of their qualifications? Can you share with us any figures of complaints lodged specific to doctors with limited registration hired by the two universities? As for the hiring of overseas doctors by the two universities, I think only we have to ask the universities themselves. The MCHA's work is to assess whether the qualifications of the doctors are reasonable. The responsibility of the Medical Council and the two universities are entirely different. The Medical Council's goal is to provide healthcare services, but for universities, they have to meet other needs. For example, research, teaching, and training of doctors, including specialist doctors. If all the overseas doctors hired are highly experienced, it would be ideal. But for locally trained doctors, they must be trained overseas as well. And when doctors are sent overseas, the other countries would prefer to send trainees to Hong Kong as well for whenever there is a new technology which Hong Kong has not seen, and sometimes doctors would be sent overseas for training. If you close this door, then our doctors would not be allowed to go overseas as well. So the function of universities is not just to offer medical services, they also need to do research and teaching and introduce new technologies to Hong Kong. As for the actual, as to how it's done, it's up to the universities. If there aren't enough doctors with enough qualifications, and they need qualified doctors to monitor the work. So the question should be answered by the universities. We cannot make a direct comparison with the Medical Council and the two universities because our services are different. Dr. Kwok, I don't quite understand your question. Chairman, perhaps I would try to clarify that. I hope I understand what your question is about. You asked about the doctors with limited registration hired by the universities and the difference between them and the doctors hired by the HA. Would doctors with limited registration hired by university be able to practice outside? I'd like to ask a follow-up question.
This document, which table are you referring to? The newest one? Yes, it's page 4. Let's use it's a CUHK example. And for those under basic medical training, about 13 of those were from the UK, about 3 were from Canada, and 1 from Germany and France and Japan. So this country we have a reciprocal training where the doctors can exchange those countries. However, for some of those countries, like Professor Lau mentioned, and I would like to provide some figures. There are 10 from mainland China, 6 from Philippines, 4 from India, and Thailand 2, Bahrain 1, Nepal 1, Oman 1, Spain 1. So, okay. Actually, there are with 2 types of limited registration and stuff. I'm talking about and pass that they could have some experience. For example, they come here to demonstrate a surgery. But let's say for some type of surgeries, Hong Kong would hire professors with seniority, or some for mainland doctors coming for training, and yet they would need to get in contact with patients. And however, we care about the patient's welfare, and for these doctors, and compared to those hired by the HA, for the HA doctors, they require certain qualifications to let them have direct contact with patients. For example, they're able to communicate directly, or possess a specialist training phase 1 exam. These are established training school which allow them to contact patients. And there are some cases, I'm not going to do specific, that some of the mainland academics or those with limited registration, they haven't completed training, and yet they're allowed to contact patients, which led to some unfortunate events. My concern is that how you admit them is the discretion of the university, especially if they come for teaching and research and would have certain experience and standards. And what worrying is that university at this training ground, and yet to get in touch with these patients. And the professor, do you have any figures, or is there any ways that could ensure that, of course, the power is delegated to the medical council, do we with more safeguard to the patient, to the patients? Are you asking a question? Would like to know what you're asking. You have to have some doubts that this limited registration doctors came through the 2 universities that led to a lot of medical blunders. Not a lot, actually. Probably not a lot, but you have been asking about this limited registration. So I would like to know what sort of criteria or approach that to ensure that if they need to get good contact with parents and how they protect their patients' interests. However, I heard from Professor Lau that they claim they haven't had any. These registrate doctors we have been treated at the same as the local doctors. So it came from mainland, so they let them contact patients directly. I want to clarify that the medical council it's impossible to provide such kind of figures on the which university hiring what kind of doctors and their qualifications. The only thing I can say is that whether the applications is reasonable. And Dr. Kwok, questions not clear is that some new technology we need to come hire patients to demonstrate them. This is not limited registration. This is temporary registration. We usually allow for 2 weeks, for a few days for surgery. So this is not under discussion here. Even for the locally registered doctors, when they receive the specialist training, they will need to be regulated. I'm sure that both universities, when training these professional doctors for overseas, or let's say exchange programs, we can't not stop this program, and it will affect our training as well. So when they arrived in Hong Kong, I'm sure they have a regulatory regime to oversee those doctors without sufficient professional qualifications in handling clinical work. I cannot provide the answers. These questions should be answered by the university themselves. Even though I work for CHK, however, this is not under my purview, so I cannot answer this. I think you explained quite clearly. I think Dr. Chung would like to respond. I think this is exactly the work of the medical council, is to safeguard the safety of the public. So we just follow the ordinance as to what kind of people can apply for limited registration. The ordinance has made it quite clear. Just in other countries, they should are tertiary qualified and actually registered with the medical authority, and as well having the relevant experience. It basically satisfies the condition which the medical council would approve, and for any additional conditions is not prescribed by the law. It's just the medical HA is worried about the risk, so it have additional safeguards. And for this, even though the specialists have their own standards and the gynecologists have their own standards, however, they're worried about having someone have a reputation risk due to medical blunders, so they have their own selection mechanism. However, they're probably not as rigorous or explicit as the HA. Well, regardless of the mechanism, for limited registration, the final ultimate gatekeeper is the medical council. You can't say it's a rubber stamp. It have to meet certain criteria, and then we shall approve it. And the additional condition is not necessary. Next one, Ms. Mo. And I would like to ask you about the same document. I of course understand that the HA hospital authority, we'll talk about on clinical doctors, with those with limited registration, and those with the universities are more for teaching. And for those HA doctors with basic medical training, they claim that none for mainland China, and yes, in Hong Kong U is actually the most number of them, and the CU is a second place in terms of their numbers. It's quite surprised is that the hospital authority requested for possess Cantonese fluency, while the university does not. And you claim that the have Cantonese fluency, or you technically favor those coming from Guangdong, or even in Fujian province, the applicants. You encourage the import of this kind. Professor Lau? And the additional conditions imposed by hospital authority, because they're really for patient service only, and one of the conditions is that they'll be professionally trained to the intermediate specialist exam. And for mainland China, there would be standardized specialist training system. And for the additional training condition that all the mainland doctors, none of them would actually qualify. And I cannot explain for them why the mainland China doctors made up the first and the second place in the universities. And for the change of registration, limited registration for 1 to 3 years would make this trend to grow. When you talk about doctors with limited registration, I think government has said it so many times. I think that 3 years would encourage more applicants, because a year by year may be deterring for some. So maybe Mr. Lai Zhang could explain. But to amend the ordinance so that when as the maximum use be increased for 1 to 2 years. I'm not talking about this. I hope the chairman should not sidetrack what others have spoken. Of course, there are more applicants, because you have more job security. So, because the 3 years period would serve as an anchor. I'm talking about the trend, a growing trend for those mainland Chinese doctors, for those with for fluent Cantonese fluency. And for the HA hiring doctors with limited registration, this is an objective standard, and hope to hire those who could help meet our medical needs. So there's 3 criteria. First, they have to possess the result of the intermediate exam, and have 3 years of clinical experience in hospitals. As for the Cantonese and English fluency, is more of a practical need. And most of them are Cantonese, however, there's some communication in mentoring for anesthetics or radiologies and so on, where they're less contact with patients, so we don't have such kind of requests. However, we don't target particularly for which country, and so this is actually an objective standard we set. So let me just skip to the document that the attorney of the assessor, the first page under the procedures. So the number is quite staggering. They claim to have 28 to 140. It's fivefold. Especially the lay members, the numbers, and each organization can nominate 2 to 10 person each. That's a fivefold increase. So the difference in numbers, is it a number of standing assessors? So let's say whenever some cases comes out, or maybe you can go. So how do you, are they appointed on an ad hoc basis whenever and such need arises, or there are time limitations? Mr. Sun, this assessor can take 2 levels, and one of the question of quorum. Let him answer first. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Mo. We have a pool of assessors, a bigger pool which we preferred. Currently, we only have 1 inquiry issues and 1 PIC, and hope that to speed up the process, we hope to have it simultaneous. So we have a few PICs so that we can have a few more inquiries. So we need more people. So we hope to enlarge the pool of assessors. So even though they're called assessors, and whether they would take part depends on whether the units of PIC inquiries took place. And now we're flexible with the numbers. This is called but the maximum number. And for the number nominated by each body, about 2 to 10 at most. So we have the room for adjustment. So do they have meetings of their own? Yes, they do. So even after we have the large pool, when we're asked to set up an inquiry panel or a PIC, let's say for 7, about 4 are the doctors and 3 are lay persons, and where do we choose 3 doctors and 3 lay persons to form a PIC? Or we need 3 PICs, so we need everything times 3 to 21 persons. About 12 of those are doctors, and at least 9 of those are the lay persons. However, it's didn't quite answer the person. Let's say I'm from patient organization or as nominated, so that means I'm assessor for the rest of my life. But after being nominated, the maximum is 3 years. The maximum term is 3 years. So it's just the same nominations for 3 plus 3. So not more than 6 members of more than 6 years. So that will not restrict by the 3.3 rule, because the medical council doesn't have a choice. For those they nominated, and they would appoint, so that the appointment can be recurring. Mr. Cheng, from what I understand, after information and the help that I have to explore that PIC. At the last meeting, the focus was set on the limited registration and so on. I think we just want to follow up on the members' comments. According to the government's proposal, the limited registration system would be extended for 1 to 3 years, quite possibly. And under the existing mechanism for the 1-year registration, that it happened that some overseas doctors that are using some HKAM recognized qualifications and become a limited registration doctor, and within this year, their country of origin, their doctor registration in their home country, which they lost the registration in their home country for whatever reason. And Chairman, do you understand my question? So the doctors arrive in Hong Kong, and they're supposed to have obtained the qualification from the home country and met under certain conditions where they will be exempt from exams, so that they become a limited registration doctor. So looking at the past situation, happened that some limited registry doctors, now that they've become back in their home country, that they're not registered with their home country. And now that we have an extended registration, so it's more likely that within the 3 years, they become a doctor with limited registration in Hong Kong, and yet in their home country, or for some reason, that their registration has revoked. Is there any kind of mechanism to ensure that these kind of doctors, their registration in their home country will remain valid for the next 3 years? Because we have extended registration for them, so in terms of the oversight, we'd have to be aware of such kind of loophole, which can turn serious. Professor Lau, would you, the medical council, understand whether a doctor would need to hold a valid registration in their home country? That I can answer. So I need to differentiate. First, register and license practice are two different things. You can stay in a register. Let's say, take the Hong Kong, for example. If you graduate and you've been registered, and you have a registry and become a registered doctor, and let's say decided that I want to practice overseas, so I retain my name in the register, but I would not apply for a license to practice in Hong Kong. So usually the registry to remove your name, usually unless let's say you retire or by death, or after a decision by medical council to be struck off the register by the medical council. So the Hong Kong mechanism is that if you want to practice in Hong Kong, you need to apply for the license and claim the past year that you have no incidents occur that caused you to be struck off, that included in Hong Kong and elsewhere. So Hong Kong, we have a very comprehensive mechanism where they will liaise with a lot of overseas countries when they were punished by the other councils overseas. So they must notify the medical council. If they're registered with us, they need to let us know. And vice versa, where we would contact other medical councils in case if they are registered overseas as well. So this is a very stringent mechanism.
That's what I'd like to know. Now, under the current circumstances where there are not yet changes, are there any overseas doctors with limited registration in this circumstances? That is, overseas their registration has been revoked, but in Hong Kong with limited registration they're still in existence. I don't know if there are such instances. I would say is the probability of this happening is low. First, the registration has to, if it's revoked overseas, that means they have committed an offense or misconduct. So in that case, overseas authorities would definitely inform us. That's the first point. Second point, every year they need to apply for a practicing certificate in Hong Kong, and then they have to put down in the form whether their registration has been revoked in any way, anywhere in the world. If they give false information, that's criminal. No, it's not just that we are concerned, but the public are not sure either. For doctors, perhaps maybe they're like other lawyers, whether the registration and the practicing certificate are the same thing or not. Of course, we don't know. But can we be very sure that we'll know immediately if someone's registration is revoked elsewhere? Can you give us some figures or information? Because if we extend the registration from 1 year to 3 years, it becomes an issue that we have to deal with. Well, I don't think I can answer that question because it's against law that's fraud. But the system itself is watertight. It's never happened before. I think the question is because, yes, when they came here, of course, they would have had registration elsewhere. But let's assume there's an old case, and after the person has come to Hong Kong with limited registration in his country of origin, his registration is revoked or suspended, or he receives penalty in any way. So the question is, how soon will you come to know about it? Instead of, say, waiting a year to take action. Usually it's very quick. They will immediately inform us, usually. You know, I'm talking about countries all over the world, all the advanced countries. What if it's, say, in Nepal? Would you know at once? Would there be some sort of notification mechanisms between the places? Or maybe in the States, in Europe, you will know. But what about in Nepal? Maybe you will only know 8 months later. Is that possible? If you ask me, well, I won't dare not say all countries. I cannot be entirely sure that all countries would inform us. But for all countries with which we have ties, there is a notification mechanism. So if I could follow up on that question too, say for doctors coming from other countries to Hong Kong with limited registration, if their application is approved, would you also inform their countries of origin that this person now has come to Hong Kong and has registered to practice medicine? Is there such a notification? Or maybe you have to ask the government. Mr. Sun? I think what Professor Lau said applies to all registered doctors. That is, through the medical council and their counterparts in other countries, there is a mutual notification mechanism. So for medical councils of different places, they revoke the registration of an individual, there is a mutual notification mechanism. That means we will inform people and people inform us if there's any revocation. Here we talk about doctors with limited registration. Yes, let me answer that question. If you refer to the last document, we did provide information. Now, under law, if you want to apply for limited registration, one of the conditions is that you have to tell people you are already registered overseas. And if that condition is accepted by the medical council, then this condition could be removed. No, I know what it's like during the time of application. We're talking after approval. And what Mr. Zhang is saying, that you want us to give them 3 years. Now, in the first year, of course, you will check. But over 3 years, how soon will you know there's a problem and you're able to detect such cases at once? But every year they have to do some work. No, but with 1 year limited registration, of course, you have to do it every year. No, even for 3 year limited registration, there must be renewed every year. So you mean for a 3 year limited registration period, the license must be renewed every year? So usually there will be a mutual notification mechanism, right? So is it possible to spell out in the law that, now you said that if the doctor of limited registration doesn't tell you his registration is invoked, is criminal, but is a duty that he must tell you when his registration is revoked, not at the time of renewal? No, the doctor must tell us every year. For full registration, limited registration, in both cases, there must be notification every year. Next, Dr. Helena Wong. I know there are some members or people in the community who are worried that with limited registration, we may bring in the less than qualified doctors. But at the same time, we know outside of Hong Kong, there are many famous doctors or prominent doctors, even on the mainland. So we need not be too worried. Of course, we need to do gatekeeping, but we shouldn't be overly concerned. Now, I have 3 questions. First, the Democratic Party supports extending the limited registration period from 1 year to no more than 3 years. So my first question is this. I didn't quite get it just now. After 3 years, can they apply for renewal? So if it's renewal, is another 3 years, right? So 3 years and 3 years, can they apply for renewal again? It seems that the law is silent on that. The bill is silent on that as to how long they could renew. Now, for 3 years, it's not that they will definitely get 3 years, just that the maximum is 3 years. So they could approve for 1 year or 1.5 years, 2 years. But can the renewal be indefinite? Yes, the law doesn't say how many renewals they get. So yes, the renewal can be n times. So that means they could extend for 30 years at the end, right? Yes, because we're talking about the 2 universities. They have professors with limited registration. Some have been here for 10, 20 years. If they live in Hong Kong for more than 7 years, they could actually apply to become a permanent resident of Hong Kong. Is that the case? Mr. Sun, can I invite Mr. Fong to answer the question because he's got more experience? Yes, if he resides in Hong Kong for more than 7 years, he could apply, but whether approval is given is a matter for the immigration department. But for limited registration and whether it's full practice permission, that's a separate thing. Because if they want to get full license, they have to take exams, they have to become interns all over again, and so on. No, I think what Mr. Soon said is that if the person worked for 7 years here, then he could apply to become a permanent resident of Hong Kong. After that, whether he keeps his limited registration to practice is the case, isn't it? Well, definitely. Permanent Hong Kong residency. No, it's like my daughter. Please don't answer the question for him. I'm just saying, even if she has permanent Hong Kong residency, it doesn't mean that she can then register to become a doctor here. Yes, thank you. So I'll come to my second question. For the latest figures, there are 105 doctors with limited registration this year. So we amend the legislation to extend the limited registration period. Hopefully, then the scheme is more appealing, and there will be more people applying under the scheme. But is there a cap set by the government, or is there any target? So this number 105 could, say, be doubled or tripled. Do you have such a target in terms of our manpower planning? That is, how many doctors we're short, how many research talents we're short, and so on. So after we amend the legislation, how many vacancies could we fill? Do you have such an estimate? Mr. Sun, well, it's difficult for us to make an accurate estimate. We could only provide the mechanism with flexibility so that there are more incentives for talents to come to Hong Kong, but it's not possible for us to do any specific estimate. Now, I think there's a projection on the number of doctors we need in future. I think that's been done. Now, because we heard that we have so many plans to build hospitals or redevelop hospitals, but then there are not enough doctors. So our healthcare manpower planning must be that the government has worked out how many more doctors and nurses you need. So maybe you could never meet the needs. And then we hope, therefore, the limited registration scheme could help in a way, because we can never train enough doctors and nurses on our own. Otherwise, the waiting time would be too long. But then, are you saying that there is no target, it's just an improvement, and you're not going to set a cap? Is that the case? Mr. Sun? Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Wong. What I meant is that it's difficult for us to set a target. It's not that when the government sets the targets and it can be achieved, because it depends. First, we're just providing flexibility in the mechanism so people come here. And also all around the world, people are competing for talents. And whether people come to Hong Kong depends on whether they want to come here to work. So Dr. Wong and the Chairman are right. We have done detailed and scientific projection of the manpower needs. Yes, indeed, there is a shortage in doctors for the hospital authority and so on. On the whole, we know there is a shortage. And we said that we will rely mostly on local training. Some will take the licentiate exam in Hong Kong. The other is limited registration. These are other ways to bring in talents. So there are various ways to try to provide more flexibility. So even if there's a 10-fold increase in doctors with limited registration, it's not going to help address the shortage, right? Well, I haven't finished. I have a third question. We're talking about amending the legislation here. On the mainland, there are many prominent doctors. In other countries, there are many prominent doctors. As you say, there is a competition for talents. So would the government take the initiative to approach prominent doctors, specialists in lung specialists, liver specialists, and so on? So and then you would take the initiative to invite them to come and apply. So would you do that? Would you, be proactive in approaching these talents? Let's say you engage someone to become a professor here, say at the Chinese university, doctors with limited registration. Now, when they're hired by the CU, will they be paid the salary for CU staff? Or would they be paid differently than that for the CU and HA staff? Mr. Sun, for doctors hired by Hospital Authority, we're focusing on frontline doctors because the Hospital Authority is most short of frontline doctors. So we were talking about younger doctors who want to come to Hong Kong to work hard for us. And then Dr. Wong referred to prominent scholars teaching at the two universities. You saw that mentioned in the table. But as to what the package is like for such professors, well, I think you have to go and ask the universities. I don't have the information at hand. I don't think I'm in a position to answer for the two universities either. Professor Lau? Well, if I may add, for senior positions in the universities, i.e. professorship, usually recruitment is global. It's not just limited to Hong Kong. So we will advertise globally, and then we will choose the best person to come for interview. And the conditions are exactly the same, but we're talking about global recruitment. We're picking the best. And that's not what we're talking about, about the kind of talent we want to attract. Now, for senior positions at universities, all universities do the same, is global recruitment. But that's not what we're talking about. Here we're talking about less frontline staff. We want more frontline manpower. What's the purpose? Definitely, these people have to be of high caliber, and that's why there are requirements on quality. And what does the Medical Council want to bring in most? That is children of Hong Kong people who've gone overseas to study. Many have been granted scholarships to study overseas, and then they studied medicine. And hopefully then they will come back to Hong Kong to serve here. And there are only three stages where these people will consider coming back here. First is when they first just graduate. And the Hospital Authority is now targeting this group. And second is those receiving specialist training. Now the Hospital Authority is now targeting those who've taken intermediate exams, and they will then come back to Hong Kong for more training. And the third stage is they've completed their specialist training, and they will come back. After that, it will be hard to bring them back unless they become really good and they may be hired by universities. Otherwise, if they are doing well as a specialist in another country, why would they want to come back to Hong Kong and start all over again? So these are the three stages when we could attract people to come back. So we want to bring in a group who are properly qualified and who are good to come back to Hong Kong. Especially we're talking about children of Hong Kong people who speak Cantonese, who know the Hong Kong culture. We want to bring them back here to serve the people of Hong Kong. Now, if you give them just 1 year, And then they have to take an exam as well. They have to take the licentiate exam, and they may not be able to pass the exam in 1 year. But with 3 years, I can guarantee you these people will pass the exam. And so that's the main difference between 1 year and 3 years. Because if I know in 3 years I'll definitely pass the licentiate exam, here we're talking about people who may have been married, they have to bring the whole family back. If it's just for 1 year, they won't take the risk. But with 3 years, with a 3-year contract, they will consider coming back. So that's why, you know, the thinking will be very different. I don't know if you're talking about my family again. There are 2 such persons in my family, people who speak fluent Cantonese. Well, let's talk about your family elsewhere. Here we're talking about business. But even if you change all the registration period, you're not going to get them to come back. Next, Ms. Alice Mack. On assessors, some member asked about it. There's a big pool of assessors. For these assessors, it's the case that for the inquiry panels and the preliminary investigation committee, PIC, they will both use the same group of assessors. Now, there are other committees, for instance, the Health Care Something Committee. There are lay members and assessors mentioned. So do they all come from the same pool of assessors? So you could therefore appoint people from this pool. Is that the case? Mr. Sun? Assessors. Now, I just confirmed with my colleagues. Under the new proposal, assessors will be involved in inquiry, the PIC, and the health committee. And the duties of these the assessors in all these committees are the same as that for the medical council. So in other words, it's the same pool of assessors. Yes, exactly. It's the same pool. Next, on limited registration. Now we're talking about, of course, we're here to scrutinize the bill, so we must look at the bill. It seems that there's little change to the legislation. It's just to change the word 1 to 3. In other words, if the limited registration period is to be lengthened from 1 year to 3 years in future, the conditions to be considered by the medical council remain the same, right? So for doctors with limited registration, if they already meet the requirements, it can't be the case that they will no longer meet the requirements when the limited registration period is changed from 1 to 3 years. Now the question is, really, the doctors with limited registration have to convince or to satisfy the medical council that they are qualified. And then the condition is spelled out here, 1, 2, 3, and so on. So can Professor Lau tell us, do they just need to satisfy the objective conditions 1, 2, 3, or would there still be a discussion within the medical council to satisfy yourselves that these people are qualified?
Even if they meet the qualifications, they must be hired, and they can be hired by the HA, the 2 universities, or the Department of Health. So they must have an employer, and they must meet the minimum requirements. And usually all council members would have read the applications and letters. If anyone proposes to discuss the case, it will be discussed at the meeting. Ms. Asmack? And according to the law, there are, let's say, 5 requirements, and your council members will talk about it and approve it. So has gatekeeping already been played? By extending the limit from 1 year to 3, you will continue to be the gatekeeper, right? Yes, certainly. When they apply for renewal, they have to meet the same requirements every time. So the limited registration can last for up to 3 years, but some doctors who practice in Hong Kong must renew every year, and the Medical Council will continue to play the role of gatekeeper. All right, thank you. Second round, Dr. Pierre Chen. I'd like to follow up on the conversation between Dr. Cheng Chong Tai and Professor Lau. When I look at C brackets 2 2098/1617 brackets 02 pages 7 to 8, just now Dr. Chen Shengtai asked about the limited registration and whether there would be any gaps within the 3 years. Professor Lau told us that these scenarios seldom happen and it's non-existent. But when you, well, as I recall, he did not say for sure that it was non-existent, but he merely reported the situation. I have a follow-up question on the table, on the footnote on pages 7 to 8, the bottom of pages 7 to 8. So that was among the follow-up questions I asked last time. The medical council plays a role of gatekeeper, but in Hong Kong U and CUHK, three doctors did not have their local medical credentials in place, but their licenses were still renewed. When we look at the figures, 3 of them are no longer registered with medical authorities overseas for some reason. Assuming, well, let's not talk about limited registration for a moment. Are these people still considered doctors if they are no longer registered with the medical authorities overseas? Are they still considered doctors? Mr. Sun. As we wrote in our papers, for limited registration of doctors hired by the 2 universities, generally speaking, overseas registration as a medical practitioner is required, but this can be exempted by the medical council, and 3 doctors received exemptions. And Professor Lau was referring to doctors who had their licenses revoked for certain wrongdoings. There could be different reasons why they do not hold overseas registration. For example, they might willingly give up their registrations. So that could be requested by the doctors themselves. And all these are made very clear during the renewal, and the medical council was aware of the situation, and as empowered by the law, the MCHK granted exemptions and renewals for these doctors hired by the 2 universities. For doctors with limited registration hired by the 2 universities, if they only carry out teaching and research but not practicing, do they still need limited registration? If they do not handle patients, it's not necessary. But did those 3 doctors handle patients, or were they part of teams that manage or handle patients? The doctor-in-chief might be licensed, but those 3 weren't. Once they have limited registration, they can handle patients. This is a license, and they can meet patients one-on-one. For the layman, I like to explain the situation. For medical graduates, like MBBS, we call it MBBS Hong Kong. You can skip the internship and registration, they do not necessarily have to register as a medical practitioner, and they can choose not to practice. We have plenty of such examples. And some people would study other disciplines. You know, some of my classmates studied Chinese history. Well, one of my niece was in the same situation. MBBS is a credential which cannot be taken away from you, and you can decide whether you want to register. For overseas registration, I can talk about myself. Hong Kong used to be a British colony, and graduates who graduated from Hong Kong, you could register in the UK. So I could register in the UK, and I practiced in the UK, so I secured a 1-year license in order to practice. But after returning to Hong Kong, I no longer stayed in the practice, so I did not apply for the license, but I was still registered and I still had to pay. But some people did not want to pay, so they did not register anymore. I held a Hong Kong registration and Hong Kong license, and I could practice in Hong Kong. So whether or not I am registered in the UK would not affect me. So there are many sides to the issue. Well, my question was very clear. And I do not want to see a repeat of Dr. Junior So. And I saw 3 doctors who were not registered, and they were given a doctor's license with limited registration. So were those 3 persons considered doctors? So let's focus on the question. Anyone with an MBBS would be considered a doctor, even if there's no if they're not registered in Hong Kong. Professor Lau, I do not know about those 3 cases. Perhaps we can invite the universities to explain the situation. You are empowered by law to grant limited registration to doctors who are not registered overseas, and they can be granted a 1-year registration in Hong Kong. If you grant them the registration, of course, they must be doctors. For doctors who are not registered overseas but registered in Hong Kong, if you no longer grant limited registration 1 year later, will they still be considered doctors? If they are not registered overseas, I don't think they are doctors. This is not new anymore. The medical council is empowered to vet the applications and play gatekeeper, but there are potential loopholes because we saw people who have lost their doctor credentials. Even if you go on for another 2 hours, you might not get an answer. You were talking about 3 persons in specific. We do not know who they are. So please allow the government to look at who those 3 persons are and why their applications was granted despite a lack of registration. So Professor Lau, please look into those 3 persons. So we should focus on these 3 cases to see whether it was a loophole or a gray area. We used to have gray area. Well, with the registration now extended to up to 3 years, the impacts might be far-reaching. So should we still give 3-year registration to those with no overseas registration. I think we should not dwell on it anymore today. We should allow the government to look into the issue. Thank you very much. I was just following up on the conversation between Professor Lau and Dr. Cheng Chung Tai because I saw inconsistencies in the papers. If a doctor has its license revoked, would the news be disseminated to all affiliated medical associations in the world? Well, I have to stop you because you misunderstand the issue. You cannot put words in my mouth. I said the bodies in which he or she has been registered would be notified of. For example, if a doctor has been registered in the UK or Australia, they would be notified, but not medical associations or councils all around the world. I was trying to clarify the issue. If I apologize if I made mistakes. I just like to know the flow of information. How can we know where the doctor is registered? We would ask where the doctor has also been registered. When they apply for limited registration, would they disclose the countries in which they are registered in? No doctor will tell you whether they are registered elsewhere. Professor Lau, for graduates in Hong Kong, it's not necessarily the case. We are talking about doctors from elsewhere with limited registration. They have to tell you where they are registered, right? One of the requirements is that they must be registered overseas. According to our footnote, for the 3 doctors mentioned by Dr. Chen, when they first registered for limited registration, they had overseas credentials, but for some reason they gave up, so they lost the credential. If Dr. Chen wants to know more about the 3 doctors, we can consult the 2 universities. Dr. K.K. Kwok is not here. We do not have further questions for the second round. Mr. Yip Kin Yun, first round. Chairman, I have a news clip from Apple Daily on the 28th of July. An 84-year-old doctor with limited registrations opened a clinic in Choi Ping Estate in Kwun Tong, and apparently something happened, and the doctor had to compensate the patient. For doctors with limited registration, we talked about special scenarios such as registration overseas. For the doctor I just mentioned, was he also one of the exceptional cases? He opened his own clinic. So what actually happened? So I'd like to see if you can offer more information. And there were some doctors with limited registration hired by the HA, etc. So under what other scenarios can doctors be be granted limited registration. I'm not sure how common these cases are, so I like more information. Mr. Sun, we cannot comment on specific cases, but according to the papers we sent in last time, under limited registration, the Medical Council has different notices in place, and we are now looking at notice number 2 on the hiring of overseas doctors under limited registration by the 2 universities. We still have notices number 3 or 4 for doctors before 1964. We had a shortage of students. That's why we imported foreign doctors. It wasn't called limited registration at that time, but after we introduced limited registration, these doctors were incorporated into notices 3 and 4. So those are commonly called association doctors, but these doctors, the number of these doctors are decreasing. In the past, certain works required underground projects or works, and these doctors would be hired. And we had doctors from the Philippines. Are you referring to? Well, those were dentists. I'm referring to medical practitioners. Mr. Yip. Dr. K.K. Kwok, Dr. Pierre Chan, do you want to speak for the 3rd round? It's your turn now. For doctors with limited registration, assuming there are problems, we are not able to follow up. We saw cases involving doctors with limited registration, and when something happened, inquiries were launched. So, as Dr. K. Kwok said, we have not seen any figures on doctors with limited registration. For older doctors with limited registration mentioned by Mr. Yip, for example, the doctor aged more than 80, they still practice under limited registration. So they might be very experienced, but there was a very major incident, and a compensation of more than $1 million was given. So we do not see how we can trace and follow up on these cases. That's what Dr. Kwok and Mr. Yip said, but I have not heard any answer yet, so I'd like to follow up on that. Mr. Sun, according to the medical registration ordinance, 2 steps are required. For first, registration in Hong Kong, and 2, limited registration. Every year, they have to apply for a license to practice every year, whether for doctors with full or limited registration. They are both monitored by the Medical Council, and they have to follow up. They have to follow their guidelines. We talked about temporary registration, and sometimes we had to invite overseas experts to demonstrate certain procedures or surgeries, and the footage would be played during the meetings. And for papers from the government or the Medical Council, whenever you invite the experts, you are asking them to demonstrate some high-risk surgeries or complicated procedures for the sake of exchange. We are talking about high-risk surgeries or endoscopic procedures, and there would be risks and incidents involved.
I didn't manage to see any sort of mechanism to regulate the or having such records as mentioned by the Secretary, that how many incidents that caused by temporary registration. None. There's no such records. And this, one of them, I hope to see some relevant information. If not, would you consider taking record or keeping track? This is my follow-up question. Mr. Sun, Chairman, at hand, I don't have such information because I wonder is the Medical Council Chairman have such information? I believe that if there are any complaints records or checks evasion, or maybe the Medical Council would have such records as well. Dr. Chang, have something to add? And for medical blunders, we don't have to need to target doctors with limited or temporary registration. It happened to us full registration council. So it depends on the council complaint mechanism. So when you, all the process of handling any compensation redress system are the same. When you try to introduce a new technology or medical technique into Hong Kong, of course some are low or risk or high risk, and Hong Kong mandated they have to be familiar with the procedures. An experience guiding the inexperienced. You cannot have a novice using the equipment. You need someone overseas to do a demonstration and offer them a temporary registration. Otherwise, they can't practice here. And of course, for them to perform this procedure for any problem that arises, just like ordinary doctors. So if any problem occurred, we have a complaint mechanism to deal with it. So I don't see that why a temporary registered or limited registration doctors are any different from one with full life registration. I don't see the difference. Dr. Pierre Chen, I know that there's no such figures in hand. I see there are a lot of exchange activities going on, and like Dr. K.K. Kwok and Dr. Yip can use examples that we just can't keep track. I know there are complaints, but then the person have left Hong Kong already, or so the doctors with temporary or limited registration concerned, maybe they're from elsewhere or from mainland, so have made a medical blunder and they left Hong Kong already because without renewing the license, we don't have the right to make him return to Hong Kong. Based on the known cases and on the frequent exchanges, we have a temporary license for high-risk procedures. So you can just complain. So, but then the person would have already left. This is what happened now. So I'm asking this because I see some cases in which, well, assuming there's a doctor with temporary license with a foreign expert coming here to perform a high-risk procedure, and provide a live video feed just like the LegCo meeting for exchange purposes. I would very much like to know that is for the consent form in this kind of exchange activities. Let's say me and Dr. Kwok mentioned, let's have to do a surgery on you. Pardon me, I don't want to stop you. However, we're not talking about a temporary license. We're talking about a limited registration. If you two dwelling on this temporary license, it haven't even touched on this ordinance. So you should be spending time and discuss such hypothetical scenarios. Fine. So I'll let Mr. Yip to ask the second round. Dr. Kiki Yip. Thank you, Chairman. I have another meeting happening. I apologize if I'm repeating all this. I heard from Professor Joseph Lau, quite disappointed with what he said. I thought that the medical council had the responsibility to ensure that regardless of the type of registration a doctor may hold when performing clinical, there should be safeguards when they perform any clinical work. I've been mentioned about on temporary registration. Now that we've brought it up, we have a mechanism in place. For those who come to Hong Kong, they're usually, well, most of them are experienced and able to perform complicated procedures. And now that we have a problem in which for those who are not as such qualified, and hope that we have to have such a system in the medical council, well, they're quite no small crowd. We have 35, and then CU has 53. Together, there are 80 or 90 strong. These doctors with limited registration. When in Hong Kong, they allow them to perform clinical responsibility, which they would require to handle patients and do surgery and a lot of clinical diagnosis. And that would actually indeed affect Hong Kong patients. And the medical council, as a gatekeeper, the responsibility to protect the public and come to do not necessary and don't even know, and would delegate the responsibility to the universities. At the same time, we would extend the registration to 3 years. And I pointed out that Hospital Authority at least to have its own system in place. And you replied that HA just wanted to control the risk. I told them they wanted to do a better job and claimed they were afraid to want to shoulder responsibility. You can't this irresponsible. If I hope the university can provide them in writing what sort of criteria are in place. Even so, HA have their own criteria. Isn't medical council have their own responsibility that the doctors with limited registration, when they are performing clinical work, as had to do with every patient, we claim is we don't have it. It is not needed. Chairman, I'm not expecting this from a chairman of a medical council. I'll give them some time because they're not talking about this. So he didn't say so, or maybe didn't answer my question. I hope they can answer my question seriously. From this, your understanding of his answer is a different understanding. I would defer to you, Professor Lau. I'm very willing to accept criticism, but I must point out that the power of the medical authority is prescribed by the law. And whatever power is prescribed by the law, we shall exercise it. And Dr. Chung had mentioned that the law prescribed as they allow which kind of people to obtain limited registration. Dr. Chung, can you please read it out? Or maybe the KK was Dr. Kwok is not in the meeting room just now. We're not evading responsibility. We're only exercising power as prescribed by the law. For those with limited registration as required by the law, they must, with the power is UHK, HK, Department of Health, and HA for the offered employment, and it must have a suitable qualifications overseas, as well as having the relevant clinical experience, as well as have medical registered with a authority outside Hong Kong as of good character. As long as we fulfill these 5 criteria, the medical council will have the power to offer them the registration. It's not a must. There are other considerations. We're turning down applications for any, but how about the additional conditions would not require that? So the HA mandated them is because the HA owns consideration, for whether the university have their own consideration, so they do. As for whenever the doctors come to Hong Kong with a very dangerous doctor, as this is new to Hong Kong, in hospitals, they were supervised by the superiors. So as a first-year doctor, so after finishing the internship, if I have sufficient experience overseas, I don't feel that it would be more dangerous than a new doctor. So for any any incidents happening, we have a mechanism to accept complaints and to start inquiry. I heard the administration replied to Mr. Chan's question, Pierre Chan's question, as for the 3 cases where they're not registered with overseas. But those 3 cases, when they first registered in Hong Kong, they are at the same time qualified to practice overseas. And when they practice in Hong Kong, they decide to give up their overseas registration. I believe that this question has been answered in full. Of course, the honorable members will decide how much power they will confer to us. So we tried our best to do with whatever power has been granted. So for 1 to 3 years is not the most important thing. The most key thing is that we hope to improve the complaint mechanism. So this 1 to 3 years is what the government hope to insert to attract overseas doctors to replenish the projected shortage of Hong Kong doctors. So what we have is to enhance the complaint mechanism of the medical council. So it doesn't matter whatever you said. The work of the medical council hinges on the power conferred by the regulations, which we'll do our best to improve the existing mechanism. So I would like to ask Professor Joseph Yao, would you feel that in vetting the doctor's application for limited registration, the medical council should consider more requirements than the 5 listed by Mr. Chen? And if so, then we should have the right to ask the government to implement conditions to protect the public health. And since doctors carries only limited registration, and I do have some cases where there are some incidents, and so it's different to the local doctors return to his home country, and then the complaint led to nowhere, as he would not return to Hong Kong to practice. As they're different from from locally registered doctors because they study here, they work here. They're more under the medical council review. So maybe the returning to the home country would be Bahrain or mainland China. So the medical council when allowing them to perform clinical work, you're conferring the same rights to them as other doctors to handle patients and to write any diagnosis and perform procedure. Don't you think the medical council should have more power to do so? Okay. As for how much power we have decided by the LegCo Council, we only access the power as dispensed by LegCo. So I want to make clear once again what is the vetting procedure. When we have an applicant for a limited registration, usually 3 is employer, the 3, 4 organization, 2 unis and Department of Health and Hospital Authority. So usually they're required to fill out a form. Why do we need it, and what are qualifications and experience? So upon receiving the forms, so usually we just circulate the form by member to council members. If the council member thinks the candidate is okay and can be approved, and if there's any one member have offered opinion on the case, that will be discussed at the council. So and like that, I dispute what you said of being irresponsible or rubber stamping and so on. This is not the case. This actually gone through and circulate among the 24 members, which would approve, and there's only one, and all the objections or doubts will be discussed. This is what uncommon that would require supplementary information before approval. So we've done what we can. If you offer suggestion, we welcome them, or even say to want to legislate to tighten it. So we just shall shall follow accordingly. There's no conflict. So you're free to legislate to restrict the powers of the medical council or to relax. So we will just work under the legal framework. Dr. Chung, so Dr. Kiki Kwok mentioned that it's possible to have a doctor with limited registration when handling a patient and a patient complaint and the doctor left. That this is possible. And the purpose of setting up the medical council is to ensure the safety of the patients. If a patient make a complaint on a doctor, necessarily had to do with the doctor, and so we need to investigate. And after we left, that we couldn't be investigated. Even if we investigated, the highest penalty we can issue is to strike off the register. The purpose of striking off is to protect public safety, so the unscrupulous petitioners cannot practice in the society. If that person left Hong Kong, the deterrent effect would not be that matters much. If the doctor commit any blunder or commit harm, the organization would be responsible and to be liable as well. So it's not that the patient could not have any redress. Not the doctors. We need to help to strike register. We cannot do when we cannot do so. There will no compromise on protecting public health. So we shall return by 4:40. We shall take a break now.